I see diabetes coming long before it ever shows up on a blood test, almost every single week. And the strange thing is, by the time most people get the official diagnosis, their body has usually been sending warning signals for years. Not loud signals, not the kind that make you panic and call your doctor. Quiet ones, the kind that feel like nothing more than getting a little older, a little more tired, a little less like yourself. Here's what doesn't make sense on the surface. You can have a completely normal fasting blood sugar reading, walk out of your annual checkup feeling reassured, and still be years deep into a process that is quietly damaging your blood vessels, your pancreas, and your long-term health. The number on that lab slip can look fine while the underlying problem is already well underway. That's not a flaw in the testing. That's a flaw in how most people, and frankly, how most of the healthcare system thinks about blood sugar. I'm Dr. Daniel, and I work with people every week who are managing blood sugar, insulin resistance, and the early stages of type 2 diabetes. And what I've come to understand again and again is that the vast majority of what eventually becomes a diagnosis is something the body was warning about for a long time beforehand. The information is there. Almost nobody has ever been taught how to read it. So in this video, I want to walk you through exactly how diabetes warns you before it ever becomes official. The subtle signs your body sends out. The mechanism underneath all of it, which is simpler than you might think. And by the end, I'm going to give you 3 specific foods that target this mechanism directly and can start working in your favor almost immediately. Stay with me until the end, because the order I give them matters. Now, the first thing I want you to understand is that type 2 diabetes is not really a disease that arrives. It's a disease that accumulates. There was a large analysis published in the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology that looked at blood sugar patterns in adults over time, tracking how insulin resistance develops years, sometimes more than a decade, before a formal diagnosis is ever made. And that's not a minor finding. It means the line we draw on a lab report, the one that separates normal from pre-diabetic from diabetic, is really just a convenient marker on a spectrum that's already been moving for a very long time. Here's the mechanism behind that. Your body is extraordinarily good at compensating. When your cells start to resist the effects of insulin, even just a little, your pancreas responds by producing more insulin to force the message through. So your blood sugar reading can still come back looking acceptable because your pancreas is quietly working overtime behind the scenes to keep it there. That compensation can hold the line for years, but it comes at a cost. And that cost is exactly what shows up as the subtle warning signs we're about to go through. And here's the part that I think gets missed in almost every conversation about this. The compensation itself, all that extra insulin circulating in your blood, is not a neutral bystander. High insulin levels drive your body to store fat, particularly around your abdomen. They raise your blood pressure, and they place ongoing strain on the same blood vessels that feed your heart, your brain, and your kidneys. So while your fasting glucose might look fine on paper, the consequences of staying fine are already spreading through the rest of your body. This is why I tell my patients that waiting for an official diagnosis is a bit like waiting for the smoke alarm to go off after the fire has already spread through the walls. The diagnosis isn't the beginning of the problem. It's just the moment the problem becomes impossible to ignore. So let's talk about what those early warning signs actually look like, because they're subtle, and that's exactly why almost everybody misses them. The first one is feeling sleepy or sluggish about 30 to 60 minutes after a meal, particularly a meal heavy in refined carbohydrates. People tend to write this off as a normal afternoon slump, but that heaviness is often your blood sugar spiking sharply and then crashing, and your brain runs almost entirely on glucose, so when it drops quickly, you feel the drop directly as fog and fatigue. The second sign is feeling hungry again uncomfortably soon after eating, sometimes within just 2 or 3 hours. This isn't a willpower problem. When blood sugar spikes and then falls quickly, Your body interprets that crash as low fuel and sends out a hunger signal, even though you ate a full meal a short time ago. The third sign is a waistline that keeps expanding. Even when your weight on the scale stays roughly the same, this matters because rising insulin specifically encourages your body to store fat around your abdomen and around your internal organs, which is a different and more metabolically dangerous pattern than fat stored elsewhere on the body. The fourth sign is darkened patches of skin, often at the back of the neck, than fat stored elsewhere on the body. The fourth sign is darkened patches of skin, often at the back of the neck, in the armpits or in skin folds. This is called acanthosis nigricans, and it happens because high circulating insulin stimulates skin cells to multiply and produces a velvety, darker patch. It's one of the most visually obvious early signs there is, and most people have no idea what it means. And the fifth sign is a kind of persistent tiredness that doesn't really improve with sleep. Partly that's from the blood sugar swings themselves, and partly it's because your cells, even though there's plenty of glucose available in your bloodstream, are struggling to actually let that glucose in to use as fuel. So you can be surrounded by energy and still feel exhausted because the door into the cell isn't opening properly. None of these signs on their own proves anything. But if 2 or 3 of them are showing up together, that's exactly the kind of pattern worth a conversation with your doctor. Along with a simple blood test that looks specifically at fasting insulin, not just fasting glucose, because insulin tends to rise long before glucose does. Now we get to the central mechanism, because almost everything we just described traces back to one underlying pattern. And that pattern is repeated blood sugar spikes throughout the day. Think about how most people actually eat. Breakfast is cereal or toast or a pastry, all refined carbohydrate that breaks down into sugar almost immediately. A few hours later, there's a snack, often something marketed as healthy, a granola bar or a smoothie, which is frequently just as much sugar in a different package. Lunch is a sandwich, more refined carbohydrate. Mid-afternoon, there's another dip in energy, so another snack. Dinner often includes pasta or rice or bread alongside the meal. And then there's something in the evening as well. Every single one of those moments produces a spike in blood sugar, followed by a surge of insulin to bring it back down. If you do that 5, 6, 7 times a day, every day, for years, your cells slowly start to resist the insulin signal simply because they're being exposed to it so constantly that they stop responding the way they used to. It's a bit like a smoke detector that goes off so often it eventually gets ignored. Your cells essentially turn down their sensitivity because the signal never stops. This is why the timing and frequency of eating matters just as much as what you're eating. A diet that looks reasonably healthy on paper can still be driving insulin resistance forward if it involves constant grazing throughout the day with very little time spent at a low, settled baseline. So let's go one layer deeper into the mechanism, because understanding this is what makes the solution make sense. Every time your blood sugar spikes, those excess sugar molecules circulating in your bloodstream don't just disappear quietly. Some of them stick to proteins in your blood vessels, your nerves, and your tissues, in a process called glycation. Picture a cut apple left out on the counter, slowly turning brown and stiff at the surface. That's a similar kind of chemical process. Over years of repeated spikes, that stiffening and damage accumulates in the small blood vessels feeding your eyes, your kidneys, your nerves, and your heart. At the same time, that repeated flood of insulin is telling your liver and your muscles to store any sugar you're not using as fat. And once those storage sites start filling up, the excess gets pushed toward visceral fat, the fat that wraps around your internal organs. And visceral fat is not just inactive padding. It actively releases inflammatory signals into your bloodstream around the clock. And that low-grade inflammation makes your cells even less responsive to insulin, which then requires even more insulin to compensate. It becomes a cycle that reinforces itself. This is the entire mechanism behind almost every one of those subtle warning signs we covered earlier. The afternoon crash, the rebound hunger, the expanding waistline, the dark patches of skin, the persistent fatigue. They are all downstream consequences of the same root process, repeating itself meal after meal, year after year. And here's the genuinely encouraging part of this. Because the mechanism is consistent, the intervention can be consistent too. You don't need a different strategy for each individual sign. You need a strategy that interrupts the spike and crash pattern at its source. And that's exactly where these three foods come in. The first food I want you to know about is something most people already have in their kitchen, and it's apple cider vinegar. There was a study published in the journal Diabetes Care that had participants consume a small amount of vinegar before a high carbohydrate meal, and it found a meaningful reduction in the blood sugar spike that followed, compared to the same meal eaten without it. The mechanism here is fairly elegant. The acetic acid in vinegar appears to slow the activity of certain enzymes, responsible for breaking starches down into sugar, which means the sugar from your meal enters your bloodstream more gradually instead of all at once. In practice, this looks like 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar diluted in a glass of water, and that's all you need. Taken about 10 to 15 minutes before a meal that's higher in refined carbohydrates. It's not about drinking it straight, which can be harsh on your throat and your teeth over time. Diluted before the meal is the version that actually matches what the research looked at. The second food is cinnamon, specifically Ceylon cinnamon, and the research here connects directly back to the insulin resistance mechanism we just covered. A meta-analysis looking at multiple trials found that regular cinnamon intake was associated with measurable improvements in fasting blood sugar and in markers of insulin sensitivity. The proposed mechanism is that certain compounds in cinnamon appear to help activate the same pathway that insulin uses to let glucose into your cells, essentially giving that pathway a second route to open the door, even when insulin signaling alone isn't working as efficiently as it should. This is also a good moment for an important distinction, because not everyone has been taught this. There are two main types of cinnamon, Ceylon and cassia. And cassia, which is the cheaper, more common variety found in most grocery store spice aisles. It contains a compound called coumarin that can be harder on your liver in larger amounts over time. Ceylon cinnamon contains far less of it, so if you're going to make this a regular habit, it's worth specifically looking for Ceylon on the label. About half a teaspoon a day, stirred into coffee, yogurt, or oatmeal, is the range most of the research has used. The third food isn't really a single food. It's a sequencing strategy, and it might be the single most underrated tool in this entire conversation, which is eating protein and fiber before you eat your carbohydrates at the same meal. There was research out of Cornell that tracked what happened to blood sugar when the exact same meal was eaten in a different order. Vegetables and protein first, carbohydrates last, compared to eating everything together or carbohydrates first. The group that ate protein and fiber first showed a significantly smaller blood sugar spike from the identical meal. Same calories, same ingredients, different sequence, meaningfully different result. The mechanism makes sense once you understand it. Protein and fiber slow down how quickly your stomach empties into your small intestine, which slows down how quickly the carbohydrate sugars that follow can be absorbed into your bloodstream. So instead of a sharp spike, you get a gentler curve. In practice, this means if dinner is chicken, vegetables, and rice, you eat the chicken and the vegetables first and the rice last, even if it's all on the same plate at the same time. No food gets removed, no major lifestyle change is required, just a different order, and the spike that would have happened anyway gets meaningfully blunted.
Now, what makes these three particularly powerful is that they're not competing strategies. They work on slightly different points in the same overall process, which means they stack.
The vinegar slows down starch breakdown before it happens. The cinnamon helps your cells respond better to whatever insulin is released afterward. And the food order strategy reduces how much of a spike there is to manage in the first place. Use all three around the same meal, and you're addressing the mechanism from three separate angles at once, rather than relying on a single intervention to do all the work. I want to be very clear about something here, because it matters. None of these three things are a substitute for the bigger picture changes that matter most. Things like reducing how often you eat refined carbohydrates throughout the day, moving your body regularly, and getting consistent sleep. But they are a legitimate, evidence-supported way to reduce the damage from the meals you're already going to eat, starting with your very next one. Here's how I'd actually approach this if I were starting today. Pick one meal a day, ideally the one that tends to be your largest or your most carbohydrate heavy, and apply all three strategies to it. Vinegar and water about 10 minutes before. Protein and vegetables first on the plate, carbohydrate last. And if you want to add cinnamon, work it into something you're already having that day, coffee or yogurt or oatmeal. Do that consistently for about 2 to 3 weeks, and the most useful thing you can do is actually track it, not guess at it. If you've got access to a glucose monitor, even a basic at-home version, you'll be able to see the difference directly, in numbers, rather than relying on how you feel, which can be misleading in the short term. And beyond the meal itself, the other thing I'd encourage is a short walk, even just 5 to 10 minutes. After the meal where you've used these strategies, movement pulls glucose out of your bloodstream and into your muscles directly, which adds another layer of blunting on top of everything else. None of this needs to be complicated, and none of it needs to be expensive. If you do notice several of the early signs we talked about earlier showing up together, the fatigue after meals, the rebound hunger, the waistline change, the skin changes, that is genuinely worth a conversation with your doctor. And a simple blood test that includes fasting insulin specifically, not just fasting glucose. Catching this in the early stage, while it's still just a pattern and not yet a diagnosis, is dramatically easier to work with than addressing it after the fact. The deeper point I want to leave you with is this. Type 2 diabetes very rarely shows up overnight. It builds quietly, meal by meal, spike by spike, over years. And your body is giving you information about that process long before any official test confirms it. You don't need to wait for a diagnosis to start paying attention to that information. And you don't need a complicated overhaul to start responding to it. 3 specific foods, used consistently, targeting the actual mechanism we walked through today, can make a real and measurable difference, starting with your very next meal. If you found this useful, the best way to support this channel is to like the video and subscribe. And if you want to understand the broader pattern behind blood sugar swings, I have another video that walks through exactly what happens in your body in the hours after a high sugar meal, which I think pairs really well with everything we covered here today. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.